One of the biggest misconceptions people have about narcissists is the belief that after hurting someone, they eventually sit alone and become overwhelmed with guilt. Many survivors hold on to the hope that one day the narcissist will finally understand the depth of the pain they caused. They imagine a moment of awakening, a moment when the narcissist reflects on their actions, feels genuine remorse, and wishes they had treated their victim differently. This hope is understandable because most emotionally healthy people naturally assume that others process pain and relationships the same way they do. When a caring person realizes they have hurt someone, they often feel empathy. They think about the other person's feelings, replay the situation in their mind, and genuinely wish they could undo the damage. A narcissist, however, tends to operate from a very different emotional framework. This does not mean narcissists are completely emotionless. In fact, many of them experience powerful emotional reactions after a relationship deteriorates or after they have inflicted pain on someone. The difference is that these emotions are often focused inward rather than outward. Instead of being consumed by concern for the person they hurt, they are more likely to be consumed by concern for themselves. Their emotional world revolves around protecting their self-image, maintaining a sense of superiority, and avoiding feelings that threaten their fragile ego. For a narcissist, admitting wrongdoing can feel far more dangerous than it appears. Most people see confession or accountability as a path toward healing and growth. A narcissist often experiences accountability as a threat. Deep beneath the confidence, arrogance, or self-importance they project, many narcissists carry profound insecurities. They spend enormous amounts of energy constructing an image of themselves as exceptional, superior, or blameless. This image acts like emotional armor. When evidence appears that contradicts that image, such as proof that they have deeply hurt someone, it creates internal discomfort that they desperately want to avoid. As a result, when a narcissist hurts someone, their first instinct is rarely to ask, "How much pain did I cause?" Instead, they may focus on protecting their own identity. They might justify their behavior by convincing themselves that the other person deserved it. They may minimize the damage by telling themselves it wasn't that serious. They may shift responsibility by claiming they were provoked, misunderstood, or unfairly criticized. These mental defenses allow them to preserve their self-image without having to confront the painful reality of their actions. This is why what appears to be guilt is often something else entirely. A narcissist may seem distressed after a relationship ends, but the distress is frequently connected to personal loss rather than empathy. They may feel upset because they lost access to admiration, attention, validation, or control. They may feel rejected because someone finally stopped tolerating their behavior. They may feel frustrated because their influence over another person has diminished. These emotions can be intense and even overwhelming, but they are fundamentally different from true remorse. Genuine remorse requires a person to step outside of themselves and fully acknowledge another person's suffering. It involves recognizing the harm caused, accepting responsibility, and feeling concern for the injured party without immediately shifting the focus back to oneself. For many narcissists, this process is extraordinarily difficult because it forces them to confront feelings of shame they have spent years trying to suppress. Shame is often at the center of narcissistic behavior. While guilt says, "I did something bad," shame says, "I am bad." Because narcissists have such difficulty tolerating shame, they often avoid situations that might trigger it. Rather than acknowledging mistakes, they may become defensive, angry, dismissive, or even aggressive. These reactions are not signs of strength. They are signs of someone desperately trying to escape painful emotions they do not know how to manage. Ironically, the more severe the harm they cause, the harder it may become for them to admit responsibility. The truth becomes too threatening. If they were to fully acknowledge the damage they inflicted, they would have to confront aspects of themselves that conflict with the image they want to maintain. So instead of accepting the truth, they may rewrite it. They may convince themselves that they were the victim. They may focus exclusively on their own disappointments. They may selectively remember events in ways that justify their actions. Over time, some narcissists become so invested in these narratives that they genuinely believe them. This can be incredibly confusing for those who were hurt by them. Survivors often wonder how someone can seem so unaffected after causing so much pain. They question whether the narcissist ever cared at all. They search for signs of regret and become frustrated when they cannot find them. What they are often witnessing is not a lack of emotion, but a different kind of emotional focus. The narcissist may be feeling many things, but those feelings are centered around wounded pride, damaged self-image, lost control, or perceived rejection rather than empathy for the person they harmed. Understanding this reality can be both painful and liberating. Painful because it challenges the hope that the narcissist will someday provide the validation, accountability, or apology that was deserved. Liberating because it helps explain why waiting for that moment often leads to disappointment. When people understand that a narcissist's emotional reactions are frequently driven by self-protection rather than genuine concern, they stop looking to the narcissist for answers. They begin recognizing that the closure they seek may never come from the person who hurt them. The truth is that a narcissist's suffering after hurting someone is often connected to the consequences they experience, not necessarily to the pain they caused. They may feel wounded when they lose access to someone who provided attention and validation. They may feel threatened when their reputation is challenged. They may feel angry when their behavior has consequences. But these reactions should not be mistaken for the kind of remorse that leads to meaningful change. True empathy requires humility, accountability, and a willingness to place another person's feelings above the need to protect one's ego. And for many narcissists, that is precisely the struggle they spend their lives trying to avoid. One of the most painful realities for a narcissist is not necessarily losing a relationship itself, but losing the ability to influence, control, or define the person who was once attached to them. This is why a narcissist's ego often suffers the most when they see that you have genuinely moved on. While many people assume that a narcissist is unaffected by the end of a relationship, the truth is often far more complex. Beneath the confidence they project to the world lies a fragile sense of self that depends heavily on external validation. They rely on attention, admiration, and emotional reactions from others to maintain the image they have created of themselves. When someone they once controlled begins to heal, grow, and thrive without them, it creates a challenge to that carefully constructed identity. For a narcissist, relationships are frequently tied to self-worth in ways that differ from emotionally healthy connections. Rather than viewing relationships as mutual partnerships built on respect and care, they often see people as extensions of themselves. The people around them become sources of validation, affirmation, attention, and emotional supply. Every compliment reinforces their self-image. Every act of loyalty confirms their sense of importance. Every emotional reaction reminds them of the influence they have over another person. Because of this dynamic, they can become accustomed to believing that certain people will always remain available to them. When someone finally breaks free from that cycle, the narcissist may initially assume it is temporary. They may believe that the person will eventually return, reach out, seek closure, or continue providing emotional energy. This expectation often stems from past experiences in which their manipulation tactics succeeded. They may have learned that periods of distance are usually followed by reconciliation, giving them confidence that they still possess influence over the other person's decisions. However, when time passes and it becomes clear that you are no longer emotionally dependent on them, something begins to shift. The narcissist starts facing evidence that contradicts their assumptions. They notice that you are no longer chasing their approval. They see that you are not responding to their attempts to provoke reactions. They realize that their presence is no longer central to your emotional world. What makes this especially difficult for them is that your growth becomes visible proof that their control was never as absolute as they believed. For many narcissists, control creates a sense of security. If they can predict your behavior, influence your emotions, or dictate the direction of the relationship, they feel powerful. That power helps compensate for the insecurities hidden beneath the surface. But when you begin building a life that does not revolve around them, the illusion of control starts to collapse. They are forced to confront a reality they would rather avoid. You are an independent person, capable of making choices that have nothing to do with their wishes. This realization can trigger feelings of rejection that run surprisingly deep. While narcissists often reject others without much apparent concern, being rejected themselves can feel devastating. They may interpret your independence as a personal insult rather than a healthy act of self-preservation. Instead of recognizing your growth as something positive, they may see it as evidence that they are losing significance in your life. Because their self-esteem depends so heavily on external sources, your emotional freedom can feel like a direct attack on their value. The situation becomes even more challenging when your life begins improving after the relationship ends. If you become happier, healthier, more confident, or more successful, it forces the narcissist to confront uncomfortable questions. They may have convinced themselves that you needed them. They may have believed that you would struggle without their guidance, attention, or approval. Seeing you flourish challenges those assumptions. It demonstrates that your strength was never dependent on their presence. In some cases, this can create feelings of envy. Narcissists often compare themselves to others, constantly measuring their status, success, and importance. When they see someone they once controlled achieving peace and happiness, they may experience resentment because it highlights what they themselves lack internally. While they seek validation from external sources, you are learning to create stability from within. Your progress becomes a reminder that genuine confidence cannot be manufactured through manipulation or superiority. This is one reason why some narcissists attempt to re-enter a person's life after a period of separation. Outsiders sometimes interpret these attempts as signs of love or regret. In reality, they are often driven by wounded pride. The narcissist wants reassurance that they still matter. They want confirmation that they can still influence your emotions. They want proof that their importance has not diminished. Even a negative reaction can provide this reassurance because it demonstrates that they still occupy space in your thoughts. When these efforts fail, the narcissist may experience intense frustration. They may become angry, passive-aggressive, or dismissive. They may criticize your achievements, question your motives, or attempt to undermine your confidence. These behaviors are frequently attempts to restore a sense of superiority. If they can convince themselves that your success is meaningless or that your happiness is temporary, they can avoid confronting the deeper insecurity triggered by your independence. What makes your growth so threatening is that it exposes a truth narcissists often work hard to avoid. Their sense of power was never entirely real. It depended on your participation. It depended on your attention. It depended on your willingness to remain emotionally invested in the dynamic. Once you withdraw that investment, they discover that control is far more fragile than they imagined. The narcissist may continue presenting an image of confidence to the outside world. They may act as though they have moved on effortlessly. They may even rush into new relationships or seek new sources of admiration. But beneath these actions, your ability to thrive without them can remain deeply unsettling. Every step forward you take becomes evidence that their influence has limits. Every boundary you maintain demonstrates that you are no longer available for manipulation. Every achievement you accomplish reinforces the reality that your worth was never dependent on their approval. This is why genuine healing can be so powerful. It shifts the focus away from the narcissist entirely. Instead of proving something to them, you begin proving something to yourself. You discover strengths that were hidden beneath self-doubt. You develop confidence that does not require external validation. You build a life based on your own values rather than someone else's expectations. And as that transformation unfolds, the narcissist is left facing the one thing they struggle with most, the realization that the person they once believed they controlled has become completely free from their influence. One of the most important concepts to understand when dealing with narcissistic behavior is something known as a narcissistic injury. While the term may sound complicated, it describes a psychological wound that occurs when a narcissist's inflated self-image is challenged. To an outsider, the trigger may seem small or insignificant. It could be criticism, rejection, disagreement, being ignored, losing influence over someone, or simply not receiving the admiration they believe they deserve. But for a narcissist, these experiences can feel deeply threatening because they strike at the foundation of how they see themselves. Most people experience occasional setbacks without having their entire identity shaken. They might feel disappointed by criticism or hurt by rejection, but they are usually able to separate the event from their overall sense of worth. A narcissist often struggles to do this. Their self-esteem tends to be built on a fragile foundation that depends heavily on validation from the outside world. They create an image of themselves as superior, exceptional, important, or beyond reproach, and they rely on others to reinforce that image. When something happens that contradicts it, the emotional impact can be far greater than most people realize. To understand why narcissistic injury is so powerful, it helps to recognize that many narcissists spend their lives trying to avoid feelings of inadequacy. Beneath the arrogance, entitlement, or grandiosity often lies a deep fear of being exposed as flawed, weak, or unworthy. These fears are not always conscious. In fact, many narcissists are unaware of how much their behavior is driven by insecurity. What they do know is that they feel an intense need to protect their self-image at all costs. Because of this, even ordinary situations can trigger a narcissistic injury. A partner setting boundaries may be interpreted as disrespect. A friend disagreeing with them may feel like a personal attack. A colleague receiving recognition instead of them may feel humiliating. A former partner moving on happily may feel like rejection. While most people can tolerate these experiences and process them in a balanced way, a narcissist often experiences them as evidence that their carefully constructed identity is under threat. The emotional reaction that follows can be immediate and intense. One common response is anger. This anger may appear disproportionate to the situation because the narcissist is reacting not only to the event itself, but also to the deeper feelings it awakens. Criticism that might seem minor to someone else can trigger rage because it activates fears of inadequacy that have been buried for years. The narcissist may lash out, become defensive, or attack the person who challenged them. Their goal is often to eliminate the source of discomfort as quickly as possible. Another common reaction is humiliation. Although narcissists often appear confident, they can be extremely sensitive to anything that damages their image. Public embarrassment, rejection, or failure can create feelings of shame that feel unbearable. Unlike healthy guilt, which focuses on behavior, shame targets identity. It creates the painful belief that something is fundamentally wrong with the self. Because narcissists struggle to tolerate these feelings, they often go to great lengths to escape them. One way they do this is through blame. Rather than accepting responsibility for what happened, they shift fault onto others. If a relationship ends, they may insist that their former partner was the problem. If they fail at something, they may blame circumstances, coworkers, friends, or family members. This allows them to avoid confronting the possibility that their own actions contributed to the outcome. The blame becomes a shield protecting them from deeper emotional pain. Denial is another common defense. The narcissist may refuse to acknowledge facts that threaten their self-image. They may distort reality, rewrite history, or selectively remember events in ways that support their preferred narrative. Over time, these distortions can become so ingrained that they genuinely believe them. What appears to others as dishonesty may actually be an attempt to preserve psychological stability. Narcissistic injury can also produce feelings of anxiety and panic. This is especially true when the injury involves losing control over someone or something important. A narcissist who once relied on another person for validation may become distressed when that person becomes independent. They may experience a sense of powerlessness that feels unfamiliar and frightening. Because they often depend on external sources to maintain self-esteem, losing access to those sources can create emotional instability. One of the most revealing aspects of narcissistic injury occurs when someone they once controlled begins to set firm boundaries. Boundaries communicate a simple message: you no longer have unlimited access to me. For emotionally healthy individuals, this message can be respected even if it is disappointing. For a narcissist, it can feel like a direct challenge to their authority, importance, or superiority. The boundary becomes evidence that another person has autonomy and cannot be controlled indefinitely. This is why narcissistic injury often leads to behaviors designed to regain power. The narcissist may attempt to manipulate, guilt trip, criticize, charm, or provoke emotional reactions. These behaviors are not necessarily signs of affection. They are often attempts to restore a sense of control that was lost when the injury occurred. If they can make someone react emotionally, they may feel reassured that they still have influence. What makes narcissistic injury particularly significant is that it exposes the gap between the image the narcissist presents and the reality they fear. The grandiose exterior says, "I am superior, admired, and untouchable." The injury reveals something very different. It reveals vulnerability, insecurity, fear of rejection, and fear of inadequacy. These hidden emotions are often what the narcissist is fighting to keep out of awareness. The tragedy is that because narcissists fear these feelings so intensely, they rarely allow themselves to fully process them. Instead of using painful experiences as opportunities for growth, they often respond with defensiveness and self-protection. This prevents them from developing the self-awareness necessary for meaningful change. The cycle repeats itself because the underlying wounds remain unaddressed. For those who have been hurt by narcissists, understanding narcissistic injury can provide valuable insight. It explains why seemingly small events can provoke extreme reactions. It helps clarify why accountability is often met with resistance. It reveals that beneath the appearance of confidence, there is often a profound fear of being exposed as imperfect. And it sheds light on why a narcissist may react so strongly when they lose control, face rejection, or encounter boundaries that limit their influence over others. One of the most confusing and frustrating experiences for people who have been involved with a narcissist is watching them completely rewrite the story of what happened. Events that seemed clear and undeniable suddenly become distorted. Conversations are remembered differently. Hurtful actions are minimized, denied, or justified. Responsibility disappears, and somehow the person who caused the pain ends up presenting themselves as the victim. For many survivors, this behavior feels dishonest, manipulative, and impossible to understand. Yet story rewriting is one of the most common ways narcissists protect themselves from emotional discomfort. To understand why narcissists do this, it is important to recognize how much energy they invest in maintaining a particular image of themselves. Most narcissists desperately want to see themselves as good, intelligent, superior, reasonable, or misunderstood. Their self-image is not simply a preference, it is a psychological necessity. They depend on that image to feel secure. When reality threatens it, they experience significant emotional distress. Accepting full responsibility for hurting someone would require acknowledging flaws and shortcomings that conflict with the identity they have worked so hard to create. Imagine a situation where a narcissist lies, manipulates, betrays trust, or behaves cruelly towards someone who genuinely cared about them. An emotionally healthy person might eventually reflect on the situation and admit, "I was wrong, I hurt someone, I need to take responsibility." A narcissist often finds this level of self-reflection extremely difficult because it forces them to confront feelings of shame. Instead of processing those feelings, they look for ways to make the story less threatening to their self-image. One of the easiest ways to accomplish this is by changing the narrative. Rather than viewing themselves as the aggressor, they begin focusing on every perceived mistake made by the other person. They magnify minor conflicts while minimizing their own behavior. They selectively recall moments that support their position while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. Over time, the story becomes less about what actually happened and more about what allows them to feel justified. This process is often gradual. It may begin with small distortions. A harsh comment becomes just a joke. Manipulation becomes trying to help. Repeated dishonesty becomes protecting someone's feelings. As these explanations accumulate, the narcissist creates a version of reality that feels easier to live with. The more they repeat the narrative, the more believable it becomes. Eventually, they may appear genuinely convinced that their version of events is accurate. This is one reason arguments with narcissists can feel so disorienting. You may bring up specific incidents, conversations, or behaviors, only to hear them denied or reinterpreted in ways that make little sense. Facts that seem obvious are questioned. Your memories are challenged. Your emotional reactions are portrayed as irrational. The discussion shifts away from their actions and toward your supposed flaws. Instead of accountability, you encounter deflection. At the heart of this behavior is a deep need for self-protection. If a narcissist fully acknowledged the pain they caused, they would have to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. They would have to admit that they acted selfishly, unfairly, or cruelly. They would have to accept that they failed to live up to the image they present to others. For someone whose self-esteem depends on feeling superior or blameless, this can feel unbearable. As a result, they often transform themselves into the victim of the story. This is one of the most common forms of narrative rewriting. Even when they initiated the conflict, they may focus exclusively on how they were hurt, misunderstood, rejected, or criticized. The attention shifts away from the damage they caused and toward the suffering they experienced. This allows them to preserve their self-image while still gaining sympathy from others. What makes this especially confusing is that narcissists can appear incredibly convincing. They may tell their story with confidence, emotion, and apparent sincerity. They often include enough truth to make the narrative believable while leaving out crucial details that would change the entire picture. To outsiders who are unaware of the full history, the narcissist's version may seem completely reasonable. This can leave survivors feeling isolated and invalidated, especially when others accept the distorted narrative without question. The rewriting of history also serves another purpose. It helps the narcissist avoid guilt. Genuine guilt requires acknowledging harm and accepting responsibility. It requires saying, "I did something wrong." For many narcissists, this admission feels threatening because it activates feelings of shame they are desperate to avoid. By changing the story, they reduce the need for self-examination. If they can convince themselves that they were justified, they no longer have to confront the emotional consequences of their actions. This tendency becomes particularly noticeable after relationships end. Instead of reflecting honestly on what went wrong, narcissists often create explanations that preserve their sense of superiority. They may describe their former partner as unstable, overly sensitive, controlling, or impossible to please. They may focus on isolated mistakes while ignoring years of manipulation or mistreatment. In their version of events, they become the person who was wronged rather than the person who caused harm. The irony is that these narratives often reveal more about the narcissist's insecurities than about the people they criticize. The need to rewrite history stems from an inability to tolerate imperfection. Emotionally healthy individuals can acknowledge mistakes without believing they are worthless. They understand that being flawed is part of being human. Narcissists frequently struggle with this concept because their self-worth is so fragile, admitting fault feels dangerous. The distorted narrative becomes a defense mechanism designed to protect them from emotional pain. Over time, this pattern can become deeply ingrained. The narcissist may rewrite not only individual conflicts, but entire relationships. Important events are remembered differently. Motivations are reassigned. Personal responsibility disappears. What remains is a story carefully constructed to support the identity they want to maintain. The truth becomes secondary to the emotional function the narrative serves. For survivors, recognizing this pattern can be incredibly important. It explains why attempts to obtain accountability often fail. It clarifies why presenting evidence rarely changes the narcissist's perspective. It helps people understand that the distorted story is not necessarily about objective reality. It is often about protecting a fragile self-image from feelings of shame, inadequacy, and responsibility. The narcissist's version of events may change repeatedly depending on what allows them to feel justified, superior, or victimized in the moment. Understanding this dynamic can help survivors stop chasing validation from someone whose primary goal is not truth, but self-preservation.